So my name is Shavonne Stanek, and today I will be talking about community-based organization resilience in the US. To me, a community-based organization is similar to a tree in that often their role in helping improve community health is undervalued, and they both grow where they're rooted. Community-based organizations are often working in marginalized communities. They generally represent residents of a particular area, are volunteer-driven, locally initiated, are multi-purpose, and flexible, allowing them to address an array of issues. The most common conception of community is that physical location, but community can stem from common interests like values or norms, or joint action or pattern social interactions like volunteer activities or social networks. Community-based organizations can provide economic and social resources, give community members a sense of identity, and can be an intermediary between groups of individuals and larger political institutions. Including CBOs can improve the delivery of basic health services, especially in low-income countries, and can increase accountability and community management. One study in South Africa showed that when community-based organizations are responsible for all aspects of a project, the design, management, and monitoring, the cost per beneficiary were less than half compared to when CBOs were not decision makers. They also play this crucial role where government structures are lacking and are key members of the world's third sector, those organizations that are not public or private. And this final project stemmed out of the desire to highlight that while often under-resourced, the community-based organizations in the US are still seeing success, especially during these periods of shock, be that natural disasters or the COVID-19 pandemic. CBOs are stepping up and helping their communities when often as members of the community, they are struggling. Through 20 semi-structured interviews with an array of community-based organizations, collectives, nonprofits, I listened and I learned to the key attributes of success and the challenges that we still need to talk about. The top 5 key attributes that these organizations talked about were building trust, a grounding in community, the role of community voices, the need for community-based participatory research, and the need to be nimble and adapt. This idea of nimbleness is counterintuitive to everything I was taught about nonprofit management, about setting yourself apart in the industry, about finding your niche. These organizations spoke about organic listening sessions and pivoting, especially during COVID, to actually meet the needs of the community. 6 of these CBOs set up mutual aid networks during COVID. Many organizations that were not service providing started offering services. They set up food distribution programs. And last year during the California wildfires, several of these organizations opened up their offices as a safe place for community members to go and charge their phone. And while this nimbleness might help these CBOs succeed, it's creating a lot of challenges. All but 3 of my organizations that I spoke with talked about the biggest barrier to success was funding, but not just funding, it's a lack of flexible funding, general operating budgets, meaning money isn't tied to a particular program. It's a lack of multi-year grants, which allows organizations to not worry about this annual fundraising need. But donors don't like to give general operating budgets because you can't monitor them and you can't write impact evaluation reports as easily. And many of these CBOs recognize the need to hire more staff during COVID because of an increased demand for services, but they lacked, again, these general operating budgets to do so. And there's just a lack of trust to give these multi-year grants to organizations that are continuously pivoting. Donors were saying they needed support and trust of leadership of community-based organizations before they felt comfortable giving. But one survey in Silicon Valley showed that 74% of CBOs don't have access to these high net donors to build that trust. And organizations working in marginalized communities of color were feeling an even bigger implicit bias towards funding. One report found that while immigrants and refugee communities represent about 14% of the nation's population in 2018, the share of local philanthropic dollars that were invested in these communities was less than 1% for service organizations and 0.04% for movement groups that were working on advocacy and organizing. The National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy also found that amongst the largest local community foundations that were spending roughly the equivalent of $78 per person overall, they were only spending about $6 per Black community member. So what do? We continue to have these conversations about the need for multi-year grants and flexible funding because organizations shouldn't be spending all of their precious resources on grant metrics and deliverables, which are taking away from their overall mission of getting community members what they need. And donors need to start trusting that the community-based organizations might know better what a community needs at that time, more than the donors think they do. And we need to continue recognizing the importance of this on-the-ground grassroots work that community-based organizations in the US are doing. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right, let's see, get to the questions here. This is a good one. Does the need for the nimbleness and agility override the need for a concrete identity or a brand? I think that's an interesting one that always comes up. I mean, I've taken the same courses in nonprofit management. More and more we talk about the brand and whatever. How does nimbleness and brand go together?
Yeah, I think one of the problems is that we assume that an NGO and a community-based organization are the same thing and that they should be following the same sort of parameters. And I think we need to give community-based organizations more flexibility than often we give nonprofits. So I think maybe a brand might be more important for nonprofits, but for community-based organizations, I think their branding should be the fact that they're supporting the community of which they're growing from. So I think that would be my answer.
Okay.
Very good. David.
Okay. First, what you say is really, there are several papers on research, and they show that formula money that gives you money basically without a lot of applications to grants is much more efficient than competitive grant because you waste most of your time to write a grant. And from my experience, I never delivered on any grant I was asked to. I used the money for whatever was good for me, and it was much better.
David, this is being recorded, you know.
Oh no, I said it to donor. I say, you know, so that really tells you that it's very important to have brands. Because if you develop brands, if you have a community organization that has a good brand, I think one of the reasons that, let's say, the Martin Luther King and the organization that he was able to get money because he built a good brand. And the ability to perform in crisis is very, very important. So to me, the question is, to what extent community organizations try to develop a legacy? So they can develop the grant and then they say, look at our track record. Forget about proposal because we know what we are doing. Look at our track record. I feel that that's the same strategy that we have with the MDP. I cannot promise anything to anyone, but if we can perform, we deserve at least a chance. So how do you feel about it?
So I think one of the ways that community-based organizations are setting themselves apart is, again, some of the key attributes I talked about, that lifting of community voices, those experiences of community members saying, hey, this organization helped me do X, Y, and Z. I'm now, a better person for it. Or when you see community members who benefited from an organization when they were younger come back and work for that organization 20 years later, that shows a lot and gives them a lot of branding, especially some of these youth development community-based organizations. That legacy and building connection within the community is really important.
Are they able to communicate it?
Yeah, I think that a lot of it is through, again, quotes, and some of them are also using, again, this community-based participatory research to show, hey, the way that we're organizing and collecting data is showing X, Y, and Z, and that also helps their legacy as well. So.
Mm-hmm. No, but my feeling is that the one really important research is how you help community-based organizations to show that they are worthwhile, what is effective and what is not effective. Trying to identify what really makes a difference among donor, government organization, how without a lot of effort, you can really develop the brand that you need.
I think, unfortunately, there's no easy solution to that. Again, it depends on the organization itself. with the use of academia and community-based participatory research, this is how a lot of them are showing branding and showing like, hey, we focus on environmental justice, but from a lot of different aspects and issues. So you're being nimble in that you're addressing a lot of things. You're not just doing one, but again, it really depends on the organization. Sorry, that wasn't a better answer.
Very good. Very interesting point here being made in the chat question. So there's a whole business been developed by larger NGOs to serve kind of as intermediaries between the larger funders, the foundations, the international development organizations and stuff, and these CBOs. But in many ways, I mean, there is evidence to suggest that intermediate role has gotten the CBOs kind of very hooked on and following the needs of those donors or that intermediate NGO and that brand and whatever. So it's really kind of feeding the beast, if you would, rather than genuinely. I'm not trying not to put food in your mouth, but is that words in your mouth? But is that kind of what you saw? And did the kind of the disruption? I guess I'm wondering, did the disruption of the pandemic break some of that? Those links that kind of had been pulling CBOs away from the community?
So I would say that most of the organizations I spoke with during COVID came up with a lot of very creative ways to still work with the communities, phone organizing, getting community members onto Zoom, even though that was challenging and we had a lot of laughs talking about it, outdoor social distance gatherings. Some of it, a lot of the organizations did say that COVID kind of reduced the amount of trust that was being built because it's harder to have those conversations on the computer or on the phone because you don't get that same feelings that when you're having a conversation face to face, especially with some of these very sensitive issues. I will say that there is a movement towards what's called like trust philanthropy, and I think moving away from those in-between NGO intermediaries and like giving money directly to communities. It's, I think, still pretty far off, but the conversations are coming. And COVID was an opportunity where a lot of grant makers actually while they had metrics with a lot of grants, got rid of them because of COVID. And it's opened up conversations, well, if you can do it now, why can't you do it later in the future? And so obviously there's a lot of hope that we will continue giving these flexible grants like we have been doing in COVID. But some people are a little pessimistic that it's still not there yet.
Mm-hmm. All right, listen, we should move on, but I can't resist asking this kind of question or this kind of concept that just came up, and that's, organizing at a local level, CBO, I mean, by definition, that has a political element in it, maybe small p in the sense of local politics and whatever. So what is your sense of the relationship between CBOs and politics, and how do those pieces fit together, and are there do you see alliances in this country or elsewhere where you've worked between CBOs and more formal political organizations?
I think that CBOs help community members because it gives them that kind of messenger to talk to some of these bigger institutions. Was not your question, but with a lot of the conversations I had, there wasn't that sense of like ties to particular political parties and things. It was more a sense of we can get politicians and members of the city urban planning committee to listen to us now that we have more data and we have numbers and we can show them how much of a problem this is in X, Y, and Z community. So a lot of them didn't talk about politics. Maybe that's just something I didn't hear a lot in my interviews, but yeah, that's all I can say on that.
All right. Shavonne, thank you very, very much. Another great presentation.